The last chapter actually for this class. So we're going to talk about mental health around the world and how it's not the same any place where that you go. That potentially is not the same. So if you have an emotional breakdown in Japan, they're not going to see it exactly the same as they would in the United States or England or Russia or someplace in Africa. So it's a little bit different. So let's go ahead and get started. That's the book. That's what the textbook looks like. I'm not sure why I have a picture of the third edition cultural psychology textbook. I guess this is the one you guys are using that we are using right now. I think that's the one I have anyway. No, I think I have the fourth edition. Anyway, not important. Psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the individual. The problem, what type of impairment is problematic, and what if a behavior that is rare in one context is not rare in another? And a good example would be your reaction to being attacked, what's going on in Ukraine right now. Civilians are being attacked, and of course their reaction is sometimes hysterical, is sometimes is extreme. Is that a problem? Well, in that context, no. But if they were walking down the street and somebody splashed their shoes with mud, and they had the same reaction, of course, that would be a problem. That would be an overreaction to what was going on. Indeed, some psychopathologies are more prevalent or manifest in highly different forms across cultures, and there are different sensitivities in different situations. If you are in Puerto Rico, for example, and you go to a funeral, their reaction to a funeral may be a lot more extreme than it would be in Iowa or Arizona. When my father died, we went to, and of course everybody went to his funeral. I have a brother-in-law who's Catholic and from Chicago, and when he went to the funeral, he couldn't help himself. He started crying. The strange thing is that he and my dad didn't really get along very well, and he didn't really like my dad a whole lot. But here he is; he's crying during the funeral. All of my father's children were sitting there, and we weren't crying at all because we'd watched him as he got older, and we knew what kind of a situation he was in, and we actually felt relief that he had finally passed away. But my brother-in-law reacted very, very negatively, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that my brother-in-law is Catholic from Chicago, and we're not religious, and we were from Indiana, and we just handled death a little bit differently. Living on the farm, living around farms, being around farmers, we saw a lot of death, a lot of animal death, of course, not human death, and it just didn't really impact us as much as it would somebody from the city who would see things a little bit differently. Experiencing a culture-bound syndrome generally requires one to have cultural beliefs associated with the syndrome. So if you live in one place or another, then the cultural expectations will be different. And this is where we get culture-bound syndromes. DOT is a morbid anxiety seen most frequently among South Asian males that they are losing or leaking semen, and it is believed that loss of sperm results in the person getting seriously ill. The idea is that you only have so much semen, and if you waste it or if you lose it at a certain juncture, then potentially it will sap away your strength. This often results from anxieties about disapproved sexual acts such as masturbation in the South Asian countries such as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This dot would be a meaningless label in the United States, however, where there are no cultural beliefs about the vitality that sperm endows, and no cultural beliefs about the consequences of loss of sperm. Is it possible that other cultures suffer from the same psychological disorders as the West, but don't have the same cultural beliefs associated with Western diagnoses, making them meaningless in other cultural contexts? And the answer is probably. Whereas we do not have DOT in the United States or in the Western world, where masturbation is fairly common, um, there are other problems that potentially we have that they don't have. Hikikomori is a condition in Japan characterized by living in an asocial state with no intimate relationships with anyone outside the immediate family. It first appears in junior high, and they end up reading books and watching television or playing games in their rooms. Indications are that the cause may be failure to succeed in a social world that has few options for those who don't fit in. This does not conform to criteria for any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. Staying away from other people, not having a lot of relationships, wouldn't be seen as a problem. Reading books is certainly not a problem. Watching television is certainly not a problem. Staying in your room during your junior high years is not a problem at all. It has only recently become a cultural phenomenon and is now seen, although rarely, in other East Asian countries other than in Japan. So hikikomori started in Japan, where everybody is socially connected with each other, and what they discovered was that there are select individuals that would rather not interact as much with everybody else. Now, the strange thing is that when I was in junior high school, this was me. I guess I had hikikomori, or I would have had hikikomori if we had more information about Japan back in the early 1960s. As weird as that is, approximately one child per classroom in junior high and high school is afflicted with hikikomori. Largely not existent in pre-war Japan, and it's uncommon in other cultures. So this individual lives a fairly isolated existence, which is not acceptable in Japan. The United States, it's not so bad, or it wouldn't be considered a problem. Bulimia nervosa. Bulimia is uncontrollable binge eating. The individual then takes inappropriate measures to prevent weight gain, such as vomiting or excessive exercise. Absent in most cultures of the world, making it a culture-bound syndrome, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time, and the age of people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences, than in others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant, as we said before. There is good evidence that bulimia is a culture-bound syndrome. A culture-bound syndrome, and the culture that it is bound to is the Western culture. Anorexia nervosa. Anorexia is an individual's refusal to maintain normal body weight due to preoccupation with their body. Evidence of culture-bound status. A huge increase in the rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures. Evidence of universality. Reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. And of course, anorexia is a problem in the Western world, but not so much in other places. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted among ascetics who refuse food for religious reasons and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starved themselves to model themselves after the ascetics. The ascetics were kind of an interesting group. They believed that eating any plant form or any animal form was against God's wishes. So these individuals would literally starve themselves almost to the point of death. And they were considered to be over abundantly religious. So if you wanted to be properly religious, then potentially you could become an ascetic. And of course, there were teenage girls in the 17th and 18th century who did the same thing. They starved themselves, thinking, of course, that they were mirroring the behavior of the ascetics. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence of anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places. For example, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. And of course, I have a picture of Mahatma Gandhi here. He was a leader in India. He was trying to get the English to loosen their control over the Indian continent. And one of the ways that he did that was by he starved himself to death, or he starved himself, and of course, very frequently he he was successful. And here he is with his granddaughter, I believe, and he's laying in bed because he can't move. He doesn't have enough energy. So we're gonna talk about culture-bound syndromes, other culture-bound syndromes other than DOT. Koro is the morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body. It's primarily found in South and East Asia, Japan once again, also in China. It is unclear what aspects of culture have led to the emergence of Koro. Koro-like symptoms have been found in some individuals in West African cultures, as well as in individuals in American culture who have had negative marijuana-induced experiences. So the problem is that they are afraid that this is males, of course, that their penises are shrinking into their bodies. Their penises are going away. Amok is another culture-bound syndrome. It's an acute outburst of unrestrained violent and homicidal attacks preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. It's most common in Southeast Asia. It may result from having no acceptable means to express frustration. People have said that Amok looks very similar to somebody on PCP. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century Europe among women. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex. Rates of hysteria diagnosis dropped dramatically in the early 20th century. Some think that it is due to its being replaced by other diagnostic categories, while others think that it was associated with repressive Victorian cultural norms. And when we're talking about repressive Victorian cultural norms, we're talking about their attitude towards sex. If you read Freud, the original Freud was talking about a lot of sexual repression, and in reality, Freud, of course, who wrote in the late 19th and early 20th century, was actually talking about a Europe that was under the yoke of this repressive sexual Victorian cultural norm. And so there were a lot of people that felt guilty about their sexual urges. They felt guilty that they had performed sex acts, and because of this, they would become so obsessed with the guilt that they would develop temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite. There was one famous case where a woman came in who was paralyzed, and eventually Freud, in doing psychoanalysis with this individual, Freud determined that the reason that she had become paralyzed was because she felt guilty because during sex she actually enjoyed the sex, and she moved her pelvis, and because of that she felt guilty about it, and she had hysterical paralysis. So one of the things that we need to remember, and you can take this one to the bank, that psychology is a constantly evolving topic. It's a continually evolving discipline. And this is one of the things that you have to remember. So if you're disgusted with Freud, or disgusted with Gestalt, or with Beck, or with any of the previous theorists, don't be, because things have changed over time. There was a huge fascist movement during the Depression. Politics evolve, so does psychology, because psychology reflects what people are thinking, and things change over time. Like I said, there was a huge fascist movement during the Depression that fostered Mussolini and Hitler and Franco in Spain. And we have a new fascist movement right now happening in around the world. Donald Trump is considered to be a more of a fascist idea. Le Pen in France, of course, that election is coming up, so we'll see if Macron can hold on. But Le Pen, of course, is very right wing. Erdogan in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, excuse me. Orban in Hungary. These are all fascist movements. Putin's attack on the Ukraine. Why in the world did he do that? Is that another fascist concept? He actually used Nazism as an excuse for attacking in the Ukraine, saying that they were becoming more and more fascist all the time. But of course, his attack his attack was fairly fascist. Anyway, the whole point is things change over time, and this is one of the things that you need to remember. So yeah, Freud may be incorrect for now, for this time, but he was certainly correct for the 19th and late 19th and early 20th century. So we need to be Fritz Perls. Not Gestalt is a theory, and it was Fritz Perls that had those ideas. Anyway, okay, so other culture-bound syndromes, Frigiphobia is the morbid fear of catching cold or being cold, actually just being cold. It's found largely in China. People avoid cold air, eating cold food. They dress with several layers to stay warm. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders, such as hypochondriasis and obsessive compulsive disorder. Frigiphobia may be culturally linked to Koro, where that disorder causes male sufferers to feel that their penis is retracting into the body due to an insufficiency of the male element, or the yang. Male Frigiphobia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of the female element, or the yin. In other words, they have a difficult time feeling male. Another culture-bound syndrome is Susto. It's a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. It's primarily found in Latin America. The degree of religiosity that is practiced in Latin America is much stronger than it is in the United States and in Europe, and for that reason they feel very strongly about. They feel very much attached to their soul. if you would ask me to define what my soul was, I would have a very difficult time. It's is it any different than my my awareness, my consciousness? And the answer would be they would feel so because they feel so close to their religion. Another culture-bound syndrome was Voodoo Death. This is where a person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or her, or he or she has broken a taboo. Results in severe fear reaction, which may, of course, lead to death, heart attack and death. It's mostly found in Africa, but it's also found to some extent in the Caribbean. And in the United States, it is also can be found in Louisiana. Lata is another culture-bound syndrome. It's a transient, dissociated state brought on by a startling event followed by engaging in cultural inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory of the episode. It's found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu in Japan. Of course, they live in northern Japan, in the northern island in Japan. Now, the interesting thing about Lata, this is a difficult to understand since we don't have it in the United States. But Lata would be if you get somebody scares you and all of a sudden, you pass gas or something, do something really socially, culturally inappropriate. But of course, in this case, it may be screaming or just reacting to the startling event. Malgry is a concern that one has been invaded by a totemic spirit that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in the appropriate ceremonial rituals. It's identified among the Aboriginal Australians. If you've ever been to Australia, Australia is a relatively large place. It's about the same size as the United States, actually. But each area in Australia um, has its own spirit or its own totem, and of course the Aborigines know this because they've lived there for such a long time, and all of this has been passed down. So they feel like when you go to a new area, if you cross a boundary, that you need to pay homage to the new spirit. And if you don't do this, then potentially you'll suffer from Malgry, which is, the spirit is, since you haven't been paid the right homage to the spirit, then you get sick. There you go. And of course, you see this in some of the hieroglyphics, not the hieroglyphics. What am I thinking of? The art that you see in Australia, it's marked. They mark it on rocks and whatnot, so they will. What am I thinking of? Anyway, yeah. So that it's marked. It's marked where all these places are. Argonias is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, loss of breath, and sleeping, among other symptoms. It's primarily found in Portugal and the Azores. The Azores are islands off the coast of Africa, and they are controlled by, surprise, surprise, by Portugal. So Argonias is a Portuguese disorder, anxiety disorder. Fungus is anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking. It's primarily found in Africa, the Caribbean, and among Native Americans and East Asians. I've never run into this concept of thinking too much and therefore having physical problems due to thinking too much. But and I've been around a lot of different Native American groups around the United States, but I can't tell you of any of them that believe that you shouldn't think very much because you'll become mentally exhausted. Attaque des nerfs is feeling palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations such as funerals. It has been found in Puerto Rico, and it's a lot like, what did we have just before? Lata. That's not what. Susto. It's a lot like Susto. It's found in Puerto Rico. Universal syndromes highlight the biological bases of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. The DSM-5, according to the DSM-5, major depressive disorder is diagnosed by having 5 of the following 9 symptoms: depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure, change in weight or appetite, sleep problems, psychomotor change, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or guilty, poor concentration, and suicidality. Major depressive disorder has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appear to vary. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. So does that mean the Chinese have less depression than we have in the United States? Well, they certainly have less diagnosed depression in China than in the United States. But what's the difference between China and the United States? One proposed rationale for this is due to 2 different manifestations of symptoms. There's semanticization and psychologization. The semanticization symptoms are symptoms that are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite, and then there are the psychologization symptoms, which are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. Can't remember why I put the mountain lion in there, but I guess it fits. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, and inability to concentrate. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM because symptoms were more physiological than psychological. So neurasthenia is more of a physiological state than a psychological state. Neurasthenia was in the DSM-3. It was also in the DSM-4. I think they took it out of the DSM-4-TR, if I'm not mistaken. But it's not in the DSM-5, neurasthenia. That's really kind of interesting. When we were talking about hysteria, when I first started studying psychology, hysteria was still in the DSM. It was in the DSM-3, if I am not mistaken. So it was still there, but it's not in the DSM-4, and it's not in the DSM-4-TR or the DSM-5. Why is this important? Things change over time. Some things that were acceptable before are not acceptable now. Some things that weren't acceptable before are acceptable now. So we don't recognize neurasthenia anymore as a mental illness. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualify for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. So they have 1/5 of the number of depressed people in China that we have in the United States. But could it possibly be because they diagnose differently than we do in the United States? And the answer is probably yes. Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries, even though there's more interdependence in East Asia than there is in the West. Now, what in the world's going on? It has been documented universally, but counterintuitively, it is less documented in East Asian countries than in North American countries, despite greater concerns about social harmony and maintaining face in East Asia. Certainly, East Asians exhibit greater social anxiety symptoms, and there is some link between interdependence and social anxiety symptoms. In general, though, the rates of social anxiety disorder in North America and Europe are 14 times higher than the rates in East Asia. Now we're going to find out exactly what's going on. The paradox between East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder may be due to the differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In East Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. So social anxiety is natural in East Asia. It's unnatural in the West. Why is it unnatural in the West? Because we're more extroverted than they are in East Asia. Why is it more common or more acceptable for social anxiety in East Asian cultures? Because they're more introverted. That's not to say that social anxieties do not become a problem in East Asian cultures. There is a culture-bound disorder called Taijin Kaiufusu, or a fear of confronting others. It is a fear that is solicited by social situations such that one is concerned about how uncomfortable one makes other people feel, perhaps because of their gaze, their body odor, or sweating. In other words, these people are afraid that because they sweat, or because they stink, or because they look at other people, that they're making other people feel uncomfortable. So they're afraid to look at people. They're afraid to go out in public because of their odor and because of their obvious sweating. And of course, why are they sweating? Because they're nervous. Why are they nervous? Because they're afraid that they're offending people that are around them. It has thus far been limited to Japan, China, and South Korea. But when we're talking about China, Japan, and South Korea, we're talking about a third of the world's population. So that's quite a few people. Anyway, so it's culture bound. It's culture bound to their idea or their concept that we shouldn't offend the people around us um, by sweating or by smelling differently or looking at other people. So these individuals suffering from Taijin Kaiufusu are afraid of looking at people. Suicide rates vary dramatically around the world. Eastern Europe tends to have the highest rates. Muslim nations tend to have the lowest. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with the elderly generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There is a special case in Micronesia in which there is a spike in the adolescent age group. This started primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. Now, this is in Micronesia. Micronesia are the islands in the South Pacific. These suicides were also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of these islands. Some have suggested that this spike was due to westernization of the island, leading to a loss of traditional roles for young men. So, whereas before you could define your manhood by certain steps, now that you're more westernized, those steps have gone away. So you can't become a young man. You can't do something that will make you a young man, whereas before you could. So because of that, there was something that was missing. So they were committing suicide. And here we see the suicide rates. Hungary has one of the highest suicide rates, as you can see. The United States is way down here. Here's Japan. Uh, so when you get in the way in Japan, as you get older and you get in the way, uh, you're no longer functional. The older people tend to commit suicide in Japan. This is Egypt, of course. It's a Muslim country where if you commit suicide, you don't go to heaven. So it's right down at zero. Okay. Egypt, the United States is next. Next is Micronesia, but look at this spike in Micronesia at 15 to 24, when the people are going through puberty. And then we have Japan, and then we have Hungary. Losing connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Many First Nations bands do not have a strong sense of cultural continuity due to Western colonization. Many youths cannot identify with their traditional culture and are also unable to identify with mainstream Canadian culture. Now, one of the reasons we talk so much about First Nation people is because that Heine, the author of your text, is from Canada, and he has a Japanese wife. So he talks a lot about Japan. He talks a lot about Canada. So he has done research in this area. Now, strangely enough, so have I. I've done research, but my research was in Montana. So support for this argument has come from findings that bands with stable connections to traditional cultural pasts have lower suicide rates. Such a connection is indicated by, and this is in Canada. You have to remember this is in Canada, not the United States. One of the differences between First Nation people in Canada and American Indians in the United States is that the governments have dealt differently with the two groups. You'll have to remember that Canada was controlled by England for an extended length of time until about 1869. And the English the English didn't negotiate. The English just controlled people, more or less. So there was a lot less negotiation taking place. So as far as Canada is concerned, a lot of what has happened in Canada has been allowed. The First Nation people have been allowed to do these things. In the United States, most of this was negotiated. In Canada, they tried to isolate the First Nation people, and they did that with reserves. In the United States, it was the same situation, but they were trying to get the people. They were trying to assimilate the people much more readily than they did in Canada. So the Canadians just kind of pushed them over there and tried to forget about them. And in the United States, we were constantly doing things like sending people to boarding schools. Now both countries use boarding schools, but the difference between the boarding schools in the United States and the boarding schools in Canada was that the boarding schools in the United States were trying to make the American Indians independent, and the ones in Canada were trying to make them functional. So there was that difference, and the other thing a lot of it had to do with negotiation, because the United States was writing treaties on a continual basis with tribes, and sometimes they'd throw out the old treaty and they'd write a new treaty, but they were always trying to negotiate. They were trying to negotiate peace. They were trying to negotiate non-hostility. Then in the 1920s and 30s, after there was no more hostility, there was nothing more to negotiate, one of the things they did in the United States was try to get the American Indian tribes to become independent. And that's when they negotiated the land claims. They tried to make them self-governing. The educational services were, well, that was one of the things in the treaties. Now that's, education and healthcare are two things that were in the original treaties in the United States, but not in Canada. So when all of this stuff took place, when they started actually negotiating with the First Nation people in Canada, it was much later. It was much later that they started giving them concessions and allowing them to control their own area. Before, it was all controlled by the government, and then there was a lot more self-control. And that's what he's talking about here. Such a connection, so the more that they were able to get these First Nation people to take over their own governing in Canada, the better it was. Of course, this happened much earlier in the United States, happened in the 20s and 30s, into the 40s. So there is a difference between the two, and even though people try to pretend that there is no difference between Canada and the United States and their indigenous treatment of the indigenous peoples, the reality is there's actually a great deal difference between the two places. So when we're talking about suicide, the stronger the culture due to these different aspects, then the less likely somebody's going to commit suicide. Negotiate a land claim with the government, possessing self-government, maintaining control over educational services, controlling their police and fire services, managing health services, and cultural facilities. And of course, a lot of this was negotiated back in the 20s and 30s in the United States. In Canada, this didn't happen until the 60s and 70s. The more indicators are present, the lower the suicide rate. One fundamental hypothesis that researchers have found support for is that the lack of connection to one's cultural roots is a strong predictor of suicide rates. Now remember, they were trying to isolate the First Nation people in Canada. They weren't trying to assimilate them. They didn't want them to act like people that, they didn't want them to act like the white Canadians. They were just trying to isolate them. In the United States, of course, there was this huge assimilation movement that took place in the boarding school movement. So the boarding schools in Canada were very much different than the boarding schools in the United States. So there was still a break with cultural roots, depending on where you were. A little bit stronger. There was more of a movement to assimilate in the United States. So the cultural aspect in Canada was a little bit stronger. This is compounded by the fact that many do not identify with mainstream Canadian culture. That's what's happening up in Canada anyway. Indeed, research has found that the more that First Nations communities can connect with their cultural history, the lower their suicide rates are. The communities that have the most number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of mainstream Canada. These connections include having its own policing or law enforcement organization, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having one's own political body, and whether or not a community is negotiating a claim to territorial land. Now, of course, this took place much earlier in the United States than it did in Canada. Now, actually, my dissertation had to do with this very topic, with cultural strength. I was trying to show resilience. Resilience is a shield against suicide. And I tried to show that one of the strengths of resilience was a strong cultural understanding. And that's exactly what I discovered, that the stronger the culture, the less likely, or the more resilient somebody is, and therefore the less likely they are to commit suicide. But I was dealing with Northern Plains Indians. I was dealing with people in Blaine County in Montana. Despite the universal prevalence of suicides, prevalence rates still differ dramatically across cultures. Motivations for suicide also vary greatly across cultures. Motivations in the West usually include substance abuse or depression. Motivations in Japan often deal with one accepting responsibility and or preserving your honor. Cases of the First Nations and Micronesia suggest that different cultures have different motivations for suicide, and it may carry different meaning in different cultures. For instance, in Japan, they have a long history of suicide, playing an unusually significant role with the ritualized suicide method of seppuku. And this is, well, seppuku, it actually The knife that you use, it's a knife rather than a samurai sword. This is not quite accurate. But the idea is there that if you are dishonored, then you have to commit seppuku or suicide. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features. Diagnosed given two or more of the following: schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms, and catatonic behavior. If you're just hallucinating, then that is not schizophrenia. But if you're hallucinating and have disorganized speech, then you would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disorder that is diagnosed when one exhibits two or more of these symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic or grossly disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or loss of speech. There's a good evidence of a genetic component for schizophrenia. One's likelihood of developing schizophrenia increases as the degree of genetic relatedness with someone who has schizophrenia increases. Despite its biological basis and similar incidence rates across cultures, some cultural variation still exists. That is, only 1% of general population will develop schizophrenia. Having a cousin with a disorder leads to a likelihood of 2%. Having a sibling with schizophrenia increases the likelihood to 9%. And having an identical twin increases the likelihood to 48%. As one would expect with something that has a biological basis, incidence and prevalence rates are quite similar across different cultures. But notice that, despite the role of genetics, there is still more than a 50% chance that someone would not develop schizophrenia, even if their identical twin, with whom one shares 100% of genes, has schizophrenia. Subtypes of schizophrenia vary substantially. In the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is as high as 75%. So 75% of all people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia are diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The rate of catatonic schizophrenia is only 1 to 3%. In India, rates of paranoid schizophrenia are as high as 15%. Rate of catatonic schizophrenia is 20%. So in the West, it's paranoid schizophrenia. In India, it's catatonic schizophrenia is more prevalent. Also, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery than in more industrialized societies. This is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental pathologies. The cause of this difference is unknown. Some suggest that patients are more likely to remain members of a community in such societies rather than becoming homeless in industrialized societies. Interestingly, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery from schizophrenia than in more industrialized societies, which is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental conditions. Did I just read that? Explanations of this counterintuitive pattern include laying less blame on the patient due to his or her having less of a primary sense of control, having more positive associations with what the West considers to be hallucinations, and greater involvement in the community so that the person does not get left alone. And of course, you can see what I'm talking about. In the West, where we don't believe in any kind of spiritual structure at all, then if you are seeing angels or you're seeing little green men, then we would consider you having hallucinations. But in a less industrialized place where spirituality is relatively common, and you see angels or you see little green men, then they're going to think, well, okay, well that's normal. Everybody sees angels and little green men. And of course, in the West, what do we do with our elderly? Why, we put them in nursing homes, of course. We leave them alone. And in other countries, of course, in other cultures, they're less likely to isolate people that have a problem. They're more likely to keep them in their homes. And because of that, of course, they are more likely to recover. Just as the presentation and prevalence of psychological disorders vary across cultures, the same goes for how the disorders are treated. There is a tradition in the West of patients seeing a therapist and verbalizing their feelings and problems. Likely rooted in the Western emphasis on self-expression and being in a low-context culture, among many other ideas discussed in this course, there is cultural variation in coping and seeking support. East Asians are less likely than European Americans to actively seek social support. This is due to concerns about how this will disrupt relationships with others. Instead, they rely on implicit social support, reminding themselves of the close relationships that they have. This may explain why East Asians tend to seek professional mental health treatment less than Westerners. Western treatment traditions can be traced back to Freudian times. Psychological problems are best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences. As treatment has extended into modern times, there is an emphasis on understanding the individual, his or her self-discovery, and his or her cognitive biases. Freud thought that psychological problems were best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences because such problems were believed to be rooted in people's conflicts at an unconscious level, and the therapist should then interpret these experiences and memories. Carl Rogers then introduced the client-centered approach, and other biological modes of thought have since been developed as well. But the common thread running through all the different therapy options is the client's ability to engage with the therapist. In contrast to Western style, two broad categories of treatments can be seen elsewhere. Family-centered. Family is seen as a key source of guidance and play an important role in treatment. And spiritualism and religion, construing psychological disorders as a problem with one's spirituality or a relationship with God or gods that went awry. And of course, this is what we see in other cultures. And we're trying to develop a treatment technique to use with the Dene people. And this, of course, isn't being done by me. I'm a Westerner, and I have my Western traditions, but it's being done by a Dene psychologist, Dr. Marilyn Begay, is working on this. And it should be interesting. We're hoping that we can discover a different way of dealing with Dene people who are suffering from an imbalance. In other cultures, healing practices are performed very differently. One of the most common practices is the role of families. They share the problems with the individual and also share the stigma and blame associated with whatever mental illness the individual has. Another common practice involves spiritualism and religion, which incorporates traditional healers such as shamans and sorcerers. Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflect the cultural inclinations of Japan. The two are called Morita therapy and Nikon therapy. Morita therapy is used to treat depression and anxiety symptoms. It does so by emphasizing secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. The client must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of those symptoms. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves light manual activities, such as sweeping, heavy manual labor, such as chopping wood, and other forms of life training. Nikon therapy is used to treat people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly on the kindnesses that they have received from others, while thinking about how little they have offered in return for those kindnesses. Given the cultural diversity and prevalence rates of psychopathologies, one concern that has been raised is whether Western mental health treatments may sometimes do more harm than good. For instance, it's been argued that anorexia did not exist in the same form in Hong Kong until it was imported there. Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder was not a big problem in Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami until Western aid workers insisted that they must be suffering from it. Now, this is really kind of an oddity because I was living in Omaha, right outside of Omaha in Plattsmouth, when we had a spate of suicides at one of the Catholic high schools in the Omaha area, Bryan High School. And what they did, it started out with two very popular people, strangely, who didn't know each other. One was the head cheerleader for football, and the other was the captain of the basketball team. Now, oddly enough, they didn't know each other, and both of them committed suicide. And due to the popularity of these two individuals, that we started having copycat suicide attempts. Three other people were able to commit suicide, but in total, over about a 3-week period, we had 17 suicide attempts, and five were successful. So they decided that they needed to close down the school and they needed to call in psychologists. And there was a volunteer group that came in from New York City. And it was really kind of interesting. So here we are, we have, and I know I shouldn't laugh at this, but we had, this is in the middle of corn country, with the Nebraska Cornhuskers. This is in Omaha, the agro capital of the world. Where all the commodities are sold in Chicago, but it's all grown and stored in Omaha. Anyway, so we have it's a Catholic high school, and most of the aid workers that came in from New York City were Jewish. So they started talking about some of the things that you always talk about when you're dealing with suicide in New York City. And of course, none of them fit anything that had to do with the farm kids and they were urban, but they were Omaha urban. They weren't New York urban. So these guys had no clue who they were. And it was so bizarre. It took like 2 or 3 days before the school just was totally up in arms, and the parents were coming in and they were screaming that these people weren't helping and that some of the things they talked about didn't have anything at all to do with what the problem was. So they sent the aid workers home from New York City, and it was the coming together of all these people that were really upset with with the guys that came in from New York. That's what stopped all the suicides. It was just the most bizarre thing in the world. Now, like I said, I was living in Plattsmouth. Brian is in Omaha, and Omaha, you have Plattsmouth, Bellevue, and then you have Omaha. And Brian is in Omaha. So we weren't having any problems with this, but we got to watch. Anyway, it was really kind of interesting, very bizarre. So sometimes good ideas from one place do not fit with good ideas from another place, and that is the end, I believe. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I've had a great time. I really enjoy this class. I have a good time with this class. So thank you very much for listening to me, and good luck with the final. Actually, the final is just the last exam over the last 5 chapters. But don't forget to get your papers in, and I'll talk to you next semester, if you take one of my classes anyway.